The distant thunder rumbled across the Nebraska plains as Theodora Davis gripped the reins of her panicked horses, the wagon wheels slipping in the deepening mud of the trail. Her knuckles turned white with effort as the first bolt of lightning split the darkening sky, illuminating the desolation around her miles from the safety of Fort Kearny and hours from her destination, with no shelter in sight as the storm descended with unforgiving fury. Rain lashed at Theodora's face as she struggled to maintain control of her wagon. The journey from St. Louis had been challenging but manageable until now. At 22, she'd believed herself capable of making this journey west to start a new life as a schoolteacher in the growing settlement of Cedar Ridge. Her parents had passed during the influenza outbreak of 1871. Leaving her with little choice but to accept the position offered by the town council. The right front will hit a deep rut, and Theodora heard the sickening crack of wood splitting. The wagon lurched violently, throwing her forward against the bench seat. The horses whinnied in terror as another lightning strike illuminated the sky. "Whoa!" she called, pulling back on the reins as the wagon tilted precariously to one side. The wheel had completely broken, the axle now dragging through the mud. Rain poured in sheets as Theodora climbed down, her skirts immediately soaking in the downpour. She assessed the damage with dismay. There was no chance of repairing this alone. Not in this weather, not with night falling. Panic rose in her chest. She was alone on the trail, miles from civilization, with a broken wagon and a storm growing more violent by the minute. Theodora unhitched the horses, tethering them to a nearby tree that offered minimal shelter. She returned to the wagon, retrieving her coat and bag of personal belongings. The teaching materials, her trunk of clothes, and food supplies would have to remain. The rain fell in merciless sheets as Theodora huddled beneath the partial shelter of the wagon. Her teeth chattered as the wind cut through her sodden clothing. She would surely freeze if she couldn't find proper shelter or build a fire, but with everything soaked through, the latter seemed impossible. A figure emerged from the storm-shrouded darkness, mounted on horseback. Theodora's heart leaped into her throat. Friend or foe? She couldn't tell, but in her current predicament, she had little choice but to hope for the former. The rider approached, and as another flash of lightning illuminated the trail, she saw a man atop a sturdy chestnut stallion, his face partially hidden beneath the wide brim of his hat, a bandana pulled up against the elements. "Miss," he called over the howling wind. "Are you hurt?" "My wagon," Theodora shouted back, gesturing at the broken wheel. "I cannot continue." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, leading his horse closer. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his movements suggesting strength and confidence even in the chaos of the storm. "You shouldn't be out here alone," he said, pulling down his bandana to reveal a strong jawline darkened with stubble. "I'm Kieran Davenport. I've got a cabin about a mile east of here. We need to get you out of this weather." Theodora hesitated, weighing her limited options. Stay with the wagon and risk hypothermia, or trust this stranger who had appeared like an apparition from the storm. "I cannot leave my belongings," she protested weakly, though she knew it was foolish. Material possessions meant nothing if she didn't survive the night. "We'll come back for them when the storm passes," Kieran assured her, his voice carrying an authority that somehow eased her fears. "Right now, we need to get you warm and dry." Another crack of thunder made the decision for her. Theodora nodded, gathering her small bag of essentials. "My horses," she began. "We'll bring them too," Kieran said, already moving to untie them from the tree. With practiced efficiency, he secured Theodora's horses to follow behind his own. "Can you ride?" he asked, returning to her side. "Yes, though it's been some time," she admitted. "You'll ride with me," he decided, not waiting for her response as he lifted her onto his horse before mounting behind her, his chest pressed against her back, an arm securing her as he took the reins. Under different circumstances, such proximity to a stranger would be scandalous, but survival trumped propriety. The ride seemed endless as they battled against the elements. Theodora could feel Kieran's steady breathing against her back, his body sheltering hers from the worst of the wind. Despite the chaos around them, she felt an unexpected sense of security in his embrace. Finally, a small cabin emerged from the darkness, a solitary outpost in the vast wilderness. Kieran guided his horse to the small attached stable, dismounting quickly before helping Theodora down. Her legs trembled, partly from cold and partly from the unfamiliarity of the ride. "Get inside," he instructed, handing her a key. "I'll tend to the horses." The cabin door creaked as Theodora pushed it open, stepping into the darkness. It was a simple one-room structure, a bed in one corner, a small table with 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove, and shelves stocked with supplies. It was plain but neat, the dwelling of a man who lived simply but with purpose. Kieran entered minutes later, water streaming from his duster as he hung it by the door. He moved immediately to the stove, kneeling to build a fire. "You need to get out of those wet clothes," he said matter-of-factly, not looking at her as he worked. "There's a trunk at the foot of the bed with some clothes. They'll be too big, but they're dry." Theodora clutched her bag to her chest, suddenly acutely aware of her situation. She was alone in a remote cabin with a man she'd just met. Yet what choice did she have? "I'll step outside while you change," Kieran offered, seeming to sense her discomfort. He stood as the kindling caught fire, illuminating his features properly for the first time. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 26 or 27, with intense blue eyes set in a weathered face. His dark hair fell in damp waves to his collar, and despite his rugged appearance, there was something undeniably gentle in his expression. "Thank you, Mr. Davenport," Theodora said, her voice barely audible over the storm still raging outside. "Kieran," he corrected. "Out here, formalities don't mean much." He grabbed a blanket from the bed, wrapping it around his shoulders before stepping back into the tempest. Alone, Theodora quickly changed into the offered clothing, a flannel shirt and woolen trousers that she had to roll up several times at the ankles. The impropriety of wearing men's clothing barely registered compared to the relief of being in something dry. She used a rough towel from the washstand to dry her long auburn hair as best she could before braiding it. A knock at the door announced Kieran's return. "Decent," he called. "Yes," she answered, feeling oddly vulnerable despite being more covered than she'd been in her soaked dress. He re-entered, his eyes briefly taking in her transformed appearance before turning back to the stove. "I'll make coffee," he said, setting a pot of water to boil. "It'll help warm you up. I'm Theodora Davis." She finally introduced herself, realizing he hadn't asked and she hadn't offered. "I was traveling to Cedar Ridge to take a position as the schoolteacher there." Kieran nodded, measuring coffee grounds into the pot. "Cedar Ridge is still a good day's journey from here," he said. "You're lucky I was returning from hunting when I spotted your wagon. Not many travel this route, especially with a storm brewing." "I was told it was the quickest route," Theodora explained, moving closer to the warmth of the stove. "I didn't anticipate the weather turning so suddenly." "Spring storms on the plains can appear without warning," Kieran replied, his tone not accusatory but matter-of-fact. "You shouldn't be traveling alone, Miss Davis." "Mrs. Davis," she corrected automatically, then immediately regretted the lie. Something about Kieran made her want to erect barriers, to maintain distance through formality, though she couldn't articulate why. If Kieran noticed her discomfort, he didn't show it. He simply poured the coffee into 2 tin cups, offering one to her. "Sugar?" he asked, already reaching for a small container. "Please," she responded. accepting both the sweetened coffee and the slice of hardtack he offered from a tin on the shelf. They sat at the small table, the storm creating a strangely intimate atmosphere as rain lashed against the windows and wind howled through the cracks in the cabin walls. The fire in the stove steadily warmed the space, casting flickering shadows across the rough-hewn floor. "How long have you lived out here?" Theodora asked, desperate to fill the silence with something other than the storm and her own conflicted thoughts. 3 years, Kieran answered, his hands wrapped around his cup. "I came west after the war, looking for solitude more than anything else." The war, of course. That explained the haunted look that occasionally passed through his eyes. So many men had returned from the conflict between the states changed, seeking escape from memories too painful to confront in civilization. "And did you find it? Solitude?" she asked. A slight smile crossed his face. "Most days, though apparently not tonight." Despite herself, Theodora laughed, a small, fragile sound nearly swallowed by a particularly loud crash of thunder. Kieran's smile deepened in response, transforming his face entirely. "I apologize for disrupting your peace," she said. "No need," he replied, rising to add more wood to the stove. "Some disruptions are welcome ones." The implication behind his words sent an unexpected warmth through Theodora that had nothing to do with the fire or coffee. She lowered her eyes, suddenly fascinated by the rough grain of the wooden table. "You should get some rest," Kieran suggested, gesturing toward the bed. "Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire." "I couldn't possibly," she began to protest. "You can and you will," he interrupted firmly. "You've had a difficult day, and the storm isn't letting up. Tomorrow we'll see about your wagon, but tonight you need rest." Theodora wanted to argue further, but exhaustion was rapidly overtaking her. The events of the day, the terror of the storm, and the relief of finding shelter had drained her completely. She nodded, moving to the bed in the corner. "Thank you," she said simply, settling onto the surprisingly comfortable mattress. The pillow carried his scent: pine, leather, and something uniquely male that she couldn't identify. "Sleep well, Mrs. Davis," Kieran said, turning his attention back to the stove. Theodora felt a pang of guilt at the continued deception but was too tired to correct it now. As she drifted into sleep, the last thing she saw was Kieran's silhouette against the glow of the fire, steadfastly keeping watch as the storm raged on. She woke to the sound of birds and the scent of coffee. For a moment, Theodora was disoriented, the unfamiliar surroundings confusing her sleep-addled mind. Then the memories of the previous night came rushing back: the storm, the broken wagon, and Kieran Davenport. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's small windows, revealing details she'd missed in the darkness. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, books were stacked neatly on a shelf, and a guitar rested in one corner. Signs of a life more cultured than she'd expected from a solitary frontiersman. Kieran was nowhere to be seen, but the coffee pot simmered on the stove, suggesting he hadn't gone far. Theodora rose, smoothing her borrowed clothes and attempting to make herself presentable. Her own dress hung near the stove, now mostly dry though severely wrinkled. The door opened, and Kieran entered, carrying an armful of firewood. He paused when he saw her standing there, morning light illuminating her figure in his oversized clothes. "Morning," he said, setting down the wood. "Storms past. Skies clear today." "Good morning," she replied, suddenly self-conscious. In the light of day, the intimacy of their situation seemed more pronounced. "I hope I didn't keep you from your bed too long." "I've slept in worse places," he said with a shrug, moving to pour coffee. "Hungry?" Theodora nodded, accepting the cup he offered. "Very." Kieran pulled a cast-iron skillet from a hook, placing it on the stove. "I checked on your horses earlier. They're fine, just a bit spooked still. After breakfast, we'll ride out to your wagon, see what can be salvaged. You've been very kind, Mr. Davenport, Theodora said. I don't know how I'll repay you. Kieran, he reminded her. And there's no debt to repay. Anyone would have done the same. But they both knew that wasn't necessarily true. The frontier was a place where survival often depended on the kindness of strangers. But such kindness wasn't always guaranteed. Breakfast was simple but satisfying: salt pork, Johnny cakes with molasses, and strong coffee. They ate in comfortable silence. The tension of the previous night somewhat diminished in the clear light of morning. After changing back into her own clothes, which Kieran politely stepped outside for, Theodora helped clean up the breakfast dishes. It struck her how domestic the scene was, as if they were a long-married couple rather than strangers thrust together by circumstance. They rode out to her wagon an hour later, Theodora now on one of her own horses while Kieran led the way. The damage looked even worse in daylight: the wheel completely shattered, the axle cracked, and several of her belongings scattered by the wind. This can't be fixed here, Kieran assessed, examining the broken wheel. You'll need a proper wheelwright and a new axle. Theodora's heart sank. How far is the nearest town? Lincoln Post is about 20 miles south, he said. They've got a blacksmith who could help, but we'd need to get the wagon there. We? She questioned. Kieran looked at her directly. You don't think I'd send you off alone after finding you half frozen in a storm, do you? There was something in his expression that made Theodora's breath catch a protectiveness. Yes, but something more that she couldn't quite name. I've imposed enough already, she protested weakly. It's not an imposition, he countered. Besides, I need supplies from town anyway. We can secure your belongings at my cabin, then ride to Lincoln Post tomorrow. The blacksmith there, Miller, owes me a favor. The practicality of his plan was undeniable, yet Theodora hesitated. Every hour spent in Kieran's company made it harder to maintain the emotional distance she'd carefully cultivated since her parents' deaths. There was something about him that made her want to lower her defenses, and that terrified her almost as much as the storm had. Very well, she finally agreed. But I insist on compensating you for your trouble once we reach Cedar Ridge. Kieran's expression darkened slightly. Let's worry about getting your wagon fixed first, he said, already beginning to gather her scattered possessions. They worked together to salvage what they could, loading the most valuable items onto the horses. Theodora's heart broke a little at having to leave behind some of her books and teaching materials, but Kieran promised they would return for the rest once the wagon was repaired. The ride back to his cabin was easier in daylight, allowing Theodora to appreciate the landscape. Rolling plains stretched to the horizon, dotted with wildflowers that had bloomed after the rain. Despite the challenges, she understood why people were drawn to this wild, beautiful country. How did you come to be a teacher? Kieran asked as they rode side by side. My father was a professor at a small college in Ohio, she explained. He believed in education for women as well as men. I had intended to teach in St. Louis, but after my parents died. She trailed off, the grief still raw despite the passage of time. I'm sorry, Kieran said simply. The position in Cedar Ridge offered a fresh start, she continued after a moment. A place where no one knows me or my history. Is that important? Being unknown. The question was perceptive, cutting closer to her heart than she was comfortable with. Sometimes it's easier to become who you want to be when no one expects you to be who you were, she answered carefully. Kieran nodded, understanding in his eyes. That's why I came west, to leave certain expectations behind. They reached the cabin by midday, unloading Theodora's salvaged belongings. As they worked, she found herself watching Kieran, the confident movements of his hands, the thoughtful way he organized her possessions, the occasional smile that transformed his serious face. You mentioned the war, she said as they stored the last of her trunks. Were you a soldier? Kieran paused, his back to her. Union cavalry, he said after a moment. Enlisted in 63, fought until Appomattox. The brief answer contained volumes of unspoken experience. Theodora didn't press further, recognizing the boundaries he'd established around that part of his life. My father supported the Union cause, she offered instead, though he was too old to fight. A wise man, Kieran replied, turning to face her. Fighting changes a man, not always for the better. There was such raw honesty in his words that Theodora had to look away, her own deception weighing heavily on her conscience. She wasn't a widow as she'd implied. She'd never been married at all. The pretense had been a reflexive protection, a way to establish distance and respect on the frontier where single women were rare and often vulnerable. I should confess something, she began hesitantly. Kieran waited, his expression open and without judgment. I'm not actually Mrs. Davis, she admitted. I'm Miss Davis. I've never been married. I sometimes use the title when traveling alone for protection. To her surprise, Kieran smiled. I suspected as much, he said. You don't carry yourself like a widow. No wedding band either, he added, glancing at her bare hands. Theodora flushed, embarrassed at being so transparent. You're not angry that I lied? It was a sensible precaution, he shrugged. Though unnecessary with me. I realize that now, she said softly. Something shifted between them in that moment of honesty, a barrier removed, a step toward genuine understanding. Kieran held her gaze a moment longer than necessary before turning to prepare their midday meal. The afternoon passed pleasantly as they shared a simple lunch and Kieran showed Theodora around his small homestead. He had a vegetable garden, chickens, and a stream nearby that provided fresh water. It was a self-sufficient life, though isolated. Don't you get lonely out here? Theodora asked as they walked back toward the cabin. Sometimes, Kieran admitted, but after years of being surrounded by men in camp, by death and noise and chaos, solitude has its virtues. And its limitations, she observed. He looked at her then, something unreadable in his expression. Yes, he agreed quietly. Its limitations, too. That evening, Kieran taught Theodora how to play a simple tune on his guitar after she expressed interest in the instrument. Their fingers brushed as he positioned hers on the strings, and she felt a warmth spread through her that had nothing to do with the fire burning in the stove. They made plans to leave for Lincoln Post at dawn, hoping to reach the settlement by midday. Kieran again insisted she take the bed, and this time Theodora didn't argue, though she felt guilty watching him prepare a makeshift pallet near the stove. Kieran, she said as he banked the fire for the night. Thank you again, not just for the rescue but for everything. He looked up, the firelight casting shadows across his features. You're welcome, Theodora, he said, using her given name for the first time. The sound of it in his deep voice sent a shiver through her that had nothing to do with cold. Good night, she whispered, turning toward the wall to hide the confusing emotions playing across her face. Sleep well, he replied, his voice following her into dreams that were far too vivid and far too centered on the man sleeping just feet away. The journey to Lincoln Post the following day was uneventful but pleasant. Theodora found herself laughing more than she had in years as Kieran shared stories of frontier life, the time he'd found a family of raccoons had taken up residence in his cabin during a hunting trip, or his disastrous first attempt at baking bread that had resulted in a loaf so hard he'd considered using it as a building material. Lincoln Post turned out to be little more than a collection of buildings serving the surrounding homesteads and passing travelers, a general store, a blacksmith, a small hotel, and a saloon that doubled as a restaurant. It was primitive compared to St. Louis, but the bustle of activity was a stark contrast to Kieran's solitary cabin. The blacksmith, Miller, greeted Kieran like an old friend, slapping him on the back and booming, "Davenport, didn't expect to see you until the fall cattle drive." "Circumstances changed," Kieran replied, introducing Theodora and explaining the situation with her wagon. Miller scratched his beard thoughtfully. "I can fix it, sure enough, but I'll need to see it first. Might take a couple days once we get it here, depending on what else comes in." Plans were made for Miller to ride out with his son the next day to assess the wagon and bring it back to town if possible. In the meantime, Kieran suggested they stock up on supplies and secure rooms at the hotel. The small hotel had only 3 rooms, one of which was already occupied by a cattle buyer passing through. Theodora felt a momentary panic at the realization that propriety demanded she and Kieran maintain separate accommodations, but the cost of 2 rooms would seriously deplete her limited funds. Kieran sensed her dilemma and smoothly informed the hotel owner that they would take both remaining rooms. When Theodora tried to protest later, he waved away her concerns. "Consider it part of the rescue," he said with a small smile. "Besides, I've slept under the stars more nights than I can count. A real bed is a luxury, not a necessity." They spent the afternoon purchasing supplies at the general store, where Theodora was delighted to find replacement books and teaching materials. Kieran insisted on carrying her purchases, his strong presence beside her a comfort in the unfamiliar settlement. Several times, she noticed women watching them with undisguised interest, or more specifically, watching Kieran. It was apparent that an eligible man like him was a rarity in these parts, and Theodora felt an unexpected twinge of possessiveness that she had no right to feel. Dinner at the saloon was a surprisingly pleasant affair. The food was simple but hearty, and the piano player in the corner gave the establishment a festive atmosphere. Theodora was conscious of the curious glances directed their way. A well-dressed Eastern woman in the company of the solitary frontiersman was clearly a subject of local interest. "People are staring," she murmured to Kieran over her plate of venison stew. "People always stare at beautiful women," he replied casually, then seemed to realize what he'd said and looked slightly embarrassed. "That is, you're a novelty here. Most of the women are either married or working girls?" Theodora finished for him, nodding toward the gaudily dressed women circulating among the predominantly male patrons. Kieran cleared his throat. "Yes, exactly." His discomfort was endearing, revealing a respect for her that contrasted sharply with the crude behavior of some of the other men in the establishment. It was another layer to the complex man who had rescued her from the storm, tough enough to survive alone in the wilderness, gentle enough to blush at the mention of prostitutes. As they finished their meal, a commotion at the entrance drew their attention. A group of cowboys had entered, trail dusty and loud, clearly looking to blow off steam after a cattle drive. Their boisterous energy changed the atmosphere immediately. "Perhaps we should leave," Kieran suggested, his eyes tracking the newcomers warily. Theodora nodded, but before they could rise, one of the cowboys spotted them and made his way over, swaying slightly with each step. "Well now, what do we have here?" the man drawled, his bloodshot eyes fixed on Theodora. "Ain't you a pretty thing to find in this dump?" Kieran stood slowly, his posture relaxed but his eyes hard. "The lady and I were just leaving," he said evenly. "Lady, huh?" The cowboy snorted, looking Theodora up and down. "What's a lady doing with the likes of you, Davenport? Everyone knows you prefer your own company to people." "Step aside, Jackson," Kieran said, his voice carrying a warning that made Theodora tense. The cowboy Jackson smirked, but something in Kieran's expression made him reconsider whatever he'd been about to say. He raised his hands in mock surrender. No harm meant, just making conversation with the pretty lady. Kieran placed a protective hand at the small of Theodora's back, guiding her toward the door. She could feel the tension in his body, coiled and ready despite his outward calm. Outside in the cool evening air, Theodora released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "You know that man?" "Unfortunately," Kieran replied grimly. "Wade Jackson. Trouble in human form. He works cattle drives seasonally but spends most of his time looking for fights and women, in that order." They walked back to the hotel in thoughtful silence, the encounter having cast a shadow over their otherwise pleasant evening. At the door to her room, Theodora paused, suddenly reluctant to bid Kieran good night. "Will Miller be able to fix the wagon, do you think?" she asked, stalling. "If anyone can, it's him," Kieran assured her. "Try not to worry. It's not just the wagon," she admitted. "I'm worried about what happens after." Kieran's expression softened. "You mean going to Cedar Ridge?" She nodded, surprising herself with the realization that the prospect no longer held the appeal it once had. It seemed like such a clear path before, a fresh start. But now? "Now?" he prompted gently when she trailed off. Theodora looked up at him, at the kindness and interest in his blue eyes, and couldn't bring herself to voice the confusion in her heart. "Now I'm just tired," she finished lamely. "Good night, Kieran." For a moment it seemed he might say more, might reach for her. Instead, he nodded. "Good night, Theodora. I'm in the next room if you need anything." She slipped into her room, closing the door with a soft click that felt somehow final. Leaning against it, Theodora pressed a hand to her racing heart, wondering how a man she'd known for barely 2 days could make her question the path she'd set for herself. Sleep eluded her as she lay in the unfamiliar bed, her mind replaying every interaction with Kieran since the moment he'd appeared in the storm. There was something between them, something unspoken but undeniable. The question was whether it was merely gratitude and circumstance, or something more lasting. Morning brought clarity, or at least the pretense of it. Theodora dressed in her cleanest remaining dress, grateful to be back in proper women's clothing after her brief tenure in Kieran's oversized garments. She'd managed to convince herself overnight that her feelings were a natural response to being rescued. Nothing more. Once her wagon was repaired and she reached Cedar Ridge, life would continue as planned. Kieran was waiting in the hotel's small dining room, already nursing a cup of coffee. He stood when she entered, a gentlemanly gesture that seemed at odds with his frontier appearance yet perfectly in character. "You look rested," he observed as she joined him. "Appearances can be deceiving," she replied with a small smile. But the bed was comfortable enough. They were joined shortly by Miller and his strapping teenage son, both eager to set out for the damaged wagon. Kieran insisted on accompanying them, despite Miller's assurances that they could handle it. "I'll feel better seeing it myself," Kieran said, his tone brooking no argument. To Theodora he added, "Will you be all right here for a few hours?" "I'm quite capable of entertaining myself," she assured him. "I saw the hotel has a small lending library. I'll catch up on my reading." Kieran nodded, though he seemed reluctant to leave her. "We'll be back by mid-afternoon if all goes well. Lock your door if you return to your room," he added in a lower voice. "Jackson and his friends are likely still in town." The concern in his eyes warmed her even as she pretended mild offense. "I've navigated St. Louis without a chaperone. I think I can manage Lincoln Post for a few hours." His answering smile was worth the minor deception about her urban confidence. "I don't doubt it. Still, humor me." After they departed, Theodora did explore the hotel's modest collection of books, but found nothing she hadn't already read. Instead, she decided to visit the general store again to purchase a few personal items she'd been too embarrassed to request with Kieran present. The store was quiet, with only the proprietor's wife minding the counter. The woman, a friendly soul named Martha, was delighted to have another female to talk with and eagerly shared the local gossip as she helped Theodora find what she needed. "You came in with Kieran Davenport didn't you?" Martha asked as she wrapped Theodora's purchases in brown paper. "Yes," Theodora confirmed, curious about the interest in her companion. "Do you know him well?" Martha considered the question. "As well as anyone knows Kieran, I suppose. He comes in for supplies every few months, always polite, always pays in cash. Keeps to himself mostly, though he's helped out when needed barn raisings, searching for lost children, that sort of thing. He mentioned he came west after the war." Theodora prompted, eager for more information about the enigmatic man who had rescued her. "Yes, though he doesn't talk about that time," Martha nodded. "Some say he was an officer, others that he was just a regular soldier. Whatever he was, it left its mark. He arrived here about 3 years ago, barely spoke a word to anyone. Built that cabin of his miles from town when there was perfectly good land closer." "Has he always been alone?" Theodora asked, trying to sound merely conversational. Martha's knowing smile suggested she wasn't fooled. "There was talk of a sweetheart back east who died during the war, but that's just rumor. Several local girls have set their caps for him over the years, but he's never shown interest." She leaned closer, lowering her voice confidentially. "Between us, I think he's carrying something heavy, something he doesn't want to burden another with." The insight matched Theodora's own impressions, and she felt a pang of sympathy for whatever ghosts haunted Kieran. She thanked Martha for her help and was just preparing to leave when the door opened, admitting several men including Wade Jackson from the previous night. Jackson's bloodshot eyes brightened with recognition and something predatory when he spotted Theodora. "Well, look who it is," he drawled. "Davenport's lady friend. All on her lonesome." Theodora straightened her spine, channeling the dignified demeanor she'd cultivated as a teacher. "Good day, gentlemen," she said coolly, attempting to move past them toward the door. Jackson stepped into her path. "What's your hurry, darlin'? Your protector's not around to spoil our fun this time." "Mr. Jackson," Martha intervened sharply. "This is a respectable establishment. The young lady is a customer, not entertainment." Jackson's expression darkened momentarily before he forced a laugh. "Just being friendly, Mrs. Reynolds. No harm in that." "I need to return to the hotel," Theodora said firmly, clutching her package. "Please excuse me." This time when she moved toward the door, Jackson let her pass, though she could feel his eyes on her back as she left. The encounter left her unsettled, and she quickened her pace back to the hotel, suddenly appreciating Kieran's warning. Safe in her room with the door locked as promised, Theodora tried to distract herself with the newspaper the hotel owner had provided, but her thoughts kept returning to Kieran. Martha's comments had only deepened the mystery surrounding him. What had happened during or after the war that had driven him to such isolation? And why did she care so much? The answer to the latter question was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. In just 2 days, Kieran Davenport had managed to awaken feelings in her that she'd thought safely dormant: curiosity, attraction, and a dangerous sense of possibility. The schoolteacher position in Cedar Ridge suddenly seemed like a consolation prize compared to the vibrant awareness she felt in Kieran's presence. Late afternoon brought the sound of wagons, plural, arriving at the hotel. Theodora looked out her window to see Kieran and Miller returning, not just with her damaged wagon in tow, but with all her remaining possessions loaded onto Miller's larger conveyance. She hurried downstairs to meet them, relief washing over her at the sight of her belongings safe and sound. Kieran spotted her immediately, his serious expression lightening as she approached. "We managed to get everything," he said by way of greeting. "Nothing left behind." "Thank you," she breathed, genuinely moved by his thoroughness. "I was resigned to losing some of it." Miller interrupted with news about the repairs. "Wheel's completely gone, axle cracked clean through. I can fix it, but it'll take 3 days at least." Got to make a new wheel from scratch and repair that axle proper. 3 more days in Lincoln Post. 3 more days with Kieran before continuing to Cedar Ridge. Theodora wasn't sure whether to be dismayed or delighted by the delay. 3 days it is, then, she said with forced cheerfulness. I appreciate your help, Mr. Miller. As Miller and his son departed with her wagon in tow, Kieran helped Theodora carry her personal trunks to her room. The hotel owner raised an eyebrow at Kieran entering a ladies' room, but made no comment, frontier pragmatism overriding Eastern propriety. I ran into Wade Jackson at the general store, Theodora mentioned as they arranged her belongings. Kieran's head snapped up, his expression instantly alert. Did he bother you? Nothing I couldn't handle, she assured him, though the concern in his eyes was gratifying. The store owner's wife intervened before it became uncomfortable. Martha's a good woman, Kieran nodded, though he still looked troubled. Still, it might be best if you don't wander alone while we're here. Jackson has a reputation with women. Are you appointing yourself my protector, Mr. Davenport? Theodora asked, attempting to lighten the mood. If necessary, he replied seriously. Though I've seen enough to know you're capable of handling yourself under normal circumstances. I'll be careful, she promised, touched by his concern. Kieran nodded, seemingly satisfied. There's a social at the schoolhouse tonight, he mentioned as he placed her last trunk by the window. Nothing fancy, music, dancing, refreshments. Might be a good distraction while we wait for your wagon. Are you asking me to accompany you? Theodora clarified, surprised by the invitation. A faint color touched Kieran's cheekbones. If you'd like. No obligation, of course. The idea of spending an evening dancing with Kieran was both thrilling and terrifying. Theodora hesitated only briefly before nodding. I'd like that very much. His answering smile transformed his face, making him look younger and unburdened. I'll collect you at 7 then. After he left, Theodora spent an uncharacteristic amount of time selecting her attire for the evening. She eventually chose her best remaining dress, a deep blue cotton with delicate white piping that brought out the amber flecks in her hazel eyes. She pinned her auburn hair in a simple but elegant style, allowing a few curls to frame her face. Precisely at 7, Kieran knocked on her door. When she opened it, his expression of stunned appreciation made the effort worthwhile. He'd cleaned up as well, wearing a freshly pressed shirt and his least weathered trousers. His dark hair was neatly combed, though a rebellious lock still fell across his forehead. You look beautiful, he said simply. Thank you, she replied, feeling unaccountably shy. You clean up nicely yourself. The walk to the schoolhouse was pleasant, the evening air cool but not cold. Kieran offered his arm, and Theodora took it, acutely aware of the solid strength beneath her fingertips. They talked easily about inconsequential things, the weather, the local architecture, mutual observations about frontier life compared to Eastern comforts. The schoolhouse was already buzzing with activity when they arrived. Lanterns hung from the rafters, casting a warm glow over the transformed space. Desks had been pushed against the walls to create a dance floor, and a small group of musicians played lively tunes on fiddles, a guitar, and a mouth organ. Nearly everyone from the surrounding area seemed to be present, from small children to elderly couples. Theodora felt Kieran tense slightly beside her as they entered. I should warn you, he murmured. I haven't done this sort of thing in a long time. I may be rusty. Then we'll be rusty together, she assured him with a smile. They were immediately approached by several curious locals, eager to meet the newcomer and perhaps more eager to see Kieran Davenport at a social function. Theodora was introduced to so many people that the names became a blur, though everyone was welcoming. Martha from the general store appeared with cups of punch, greeting them warmly. Kieran Davenport at a social. Will wonders never cease? she teased good-naturedly. "Don't make me regret it, Martha," Kieran replied with a small smile that took any sting from his words. "And Miss Davis, I'm so glad you convinced this hermit to join civilized company," Martha continued, giving Theodora a conspiratorial wink. Before Theodora could correct the assumption that she'd been the one to suggest attending, the band struck up a lively reel, and couples began taking to the floor. Kieran looked at her questioningly, and she nodded her acceptance of the unspoken invitation. His hand at her waist was tentative at first as he led her into the dance, but as the music flowed, so did their movements. Despite his claims of rustiness, Kieran was a capable dancer, guiding her through the steps with unexpected grace. Theodora found herself laughing as they twirled, caught up in the joy of the moment and the connection between them. "You're not nearly as rusty as you claimed," she accused playfully as the dance ended. "Some things you don't forget," he replied, his eyes holding hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. They danced several more numbers, stopping occasionally for refreshments and conversation with the locals. Theodora noticed the speculative glances directed their way, the whispered comments behind hands, but found she didn't care. For this one evening, she wanted to simply enjoy Kieran's company without worrying about what came next. During a particularly energetic dance, Theodora caught sight of Wade Jackson entering the schoolhouse with several companions. His gaze immediately sought and found her, his expression darkening when he saw her with Kieran. She missed a step, causing Kieran to look at her with concern. "Everything all right?" he asked. She nodded toward the entrance. "Jackson's here." Kieran's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "Ignore him. He won't cause trouble with this many people around." The music shifted to a slower waltz, and Kieran drew her closer than before, his hand firm at her waist. Theodora was acutely aware of the reduced space between them, of his clean masculine scent, of the way his eyes never left hers as they moved in perfect synchronicity. "Where did you learn to waltz?" she asked, desperate to break the tension building between them. "Before the war," he answered, his voice low. "My mother insisted all her sons learn proper dancing. Said we'd never find suitable wives otherwise." "And did you find a suitable wife?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. Kieran's steps faltered slightly before resuming. "No," he said simply. "The war changed things. Changed me." "How?" Theodora pressed gently, sensing he might be willing to share more in this moment. He was quiet for several measures, guiding her through a turn before answering. "I saw things, did things, came back different than I left. The man who went to war might have settled down, had a family. The man who returned." He trailed off, his gaze momentarily distant. "The man who returned?" she prompted. Kieran's focus returned to her, his blue eyes troubled. Didn't trust himself with other people's happiness anymore. The raw honesty of his admission touched something deep within Theodora. She understood what it meant to protect oneself from potential pain by avoiding connections entirely. Wasn't that partly why she'd chosen the isolated teaching position in Cedar Ridge? "Maybe," she said carefully, "the man who returned has punished himself long enough." Something shifted in Kieran's expression, a softening, a spark of something that might have been hope. Before he could respond, however, a commotion erupted across the room. Wade Jackson, visibly drunk, had grabbed one of the local girls and was attempting to dance with her despite her protests. Kieran immediately released Theodora. "Stay here," he instructed, moving toward the disturbance with purposeful strides. By the time he reached Jackson, the girl had broken free and several men were already confronting the drunk cowboy. Words were exchanged, voices raised. Theodora couldn't hear the specifics over the music, which had continued playing though many dancers had stopped to watch the confrontation. Jackson's belligerent posture suddenly shifted, and he threw a wild punch at one of the local men. Chaos erupted as others joined the fray, attempting either to restrain Jackson or join the fight. Kieran waded into the middle, his focus solely on separating the combatants. Theodora watched anxiously as he pulled Jackson away from the others, speaking firmly into the drunken man's ear. Whatever he said seemed to have an effect, as Jackson's struggling subsided. The local sheriff appeared, taking control of the situation with practiced authority. Kieran returned to Theodora's side, his expression grim but otherwise unruffled by the altercation. "I think the evening's festivities are over," he observed as the sheriff escorted Jackson and his friends outside. "Are you all right?" she asked, searching his face for signs of injury. "Fine," he assured her. "Jackson's more bluster than anything. He'll sleep it off in the sheriff's cell tonight." They said their goodbyes to Martha and the other locals before walking back to the hotel in contemplative silence. The confrontation had broken the magical spell of their dance, bringing reality crashing back. In 3 days, Theodora's wagon would be repaired, and she would continue to Cedar Ridge as planned. At her door, Kieran paused. "I'm sorry about how the evening ended," he said. "Don't be," she replied. "Until then, it was wonderful." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for asking me to accompany you." "Thank you for accepting," he returned with a small smile. "Good night, Theodora." "Good night, Kieran." She entered her room and closed the door, leaning against it as she had the night before. But this time, the racing of her heart had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with the realization that she was falling in love with Kieran Davenport. The next 2 days passed in a strange limbo. Theodora and Kieran spent most of their time together, exploring Lincoln Post, checking on the progress of her wagon repairs, and sharing meals. Each interaction deepened her feelings, yet neither of them spoke of what would happen when her wagon was fixed. On the afternoon before her departure, they walked to the edge of town, following a small creek that wound through a grove of cottonwoods. The weather was perfect: clear skies, gentle breeze, wildflowers dotting the prairie grasses. "Miller says the wagon will be ready by noon tomorrow," Kieran mentioned as they sat on a fallen log beside the water. "Yes, he told me this morning," Theodora confirmed, watching a pair of dragonflies dance above the creek's surface. "I should reach Cedar Ridge by nightfall if I leave promptly." Kieran nodded, his expression unreadable. "I've been thinking," he said after a moment, "I should accompany you. The trail can be dangerous for a woman alone." Hope flared in Theodora's chest before she tempered it. "You've done more than enough already. I couldn't ask for more of your time." "You're not asking. I'm offering." He turned to face her directly. "Unless you'd prefer to travel alone." "No," she admitted softly. "I wouldn't." Something like relief flickered across his features. "Then it's settled. We'll leave together tomorrow." They sat in companionable silence for a while, both contemplating what remained unsaid between them. Finally, Theodora gathered her courage. "Kieran," she began hesitantly, "these past days have been unexpected." He smiled slightly. "That's one word for it." "I've been thinking about Cedar Ridge," she continued, "about my position there." "Having second thoughts?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Theodora looked out over the creek, organizing her thoughts. "When I accepted the position, I was running away from grief, from memories. I thought isolation was what I needed." She turned back to him. "Now I'm not so certain." Kieran's expression was guarded, hopeful. "What are you certain of?" "That meeting you has changed something in me," she answered honestly. "That the thought of saying goodbye tomorrow feels wrong." He reached for her hand then, his calloused fingers enveloping hers. "Then don't say goodbye," he said simply. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her heart pounding. I'm suggesting that plans can change. That Cedar Ridge isn't the only place that needs a teacher. His eyes held hers, intense and sincere. That my cabin is too empty with just one person. Theodora's breath caught. Kieran, are you asking me to stay with you? I'm asking you to consider it, he clarified. Not as my housekeeper or even just as my wife, but as my partner. Someone to build a life with. He squeezed her hand gently. I know it's sudden. I know we've known each other less than a week. But sometimes life gives you a moment of clarity, and you'd be a fool not to recognize it. Tears pricked at Theodora's eyes. The storm, she whispered. The storm, he agreed. It brought you to my door for a reason, I think. People would talk, she said, though it wasn't really an objection. Kieran smiled. People always talk. Doesn't mean we have to listen. I'd need to explain to the Cedar Ridge Council, she continued, already working through practicalities. They're expecting me. We can send a letter with the next stage, he suggested. Maybe recommend another teacher if you know of one. And the school here in Lincoln Post? You mentioned they might need a teacher? They've been looking for months, Kieran confirmed. The last one left to get married in the fall. The children have had irregular schooling since then. Theodora's mind raced with possibilities. A teaching position here, a life with Kieran. A future neither of them had anticipated but that suddenly seemed inevitable. I don't want to pressure you, Kieran said, misinterpreting her silence. If you need time to think— No, she interrupted, squeezing his hand. I don't need more time. I think I've known since that first morning in your cabin, watching you make coffee, that something important was happening. Is that a yes? He asked, a smile beginning to form. It's a yes, she confirmed. Yes, I'll stay. Yes, I'll build a life with you. Yes to all of it. Kieran's face transformed with joy, years seeming to fall away as he pulled her gently toward him. May I? He asked, his gaze dropping to her lips. In answer, Theodora closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but quickly deepened as the feelings they'd been restraining broke free. His arms encircled her, drawing her closer, and she threaded her fingers through his hair, reveling in the freedom to touch him as she'd wanted to for days. When they finally parted, both breathless, Kieran rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that since I found you in that storm, he confessed. I wouldn't have minded if you had, she replied with a smile. He laughed, the sound lighter and more carefree than she'd ever heard from him. If I'd known that, I might have been bolder. You're plenty bold enough, she assured him, her cheeks flushing at the thought of what their future together would hold. They returned to town hand in hand, plans already forming between them. They would marry quickly. The circuit preacher was due in Lincoln Post within the week. Theodora would apply for the teaching position immediately. Kieran would expand his cabin to accommodate a family, the family they both hoped to create together. News of their engagement spread through Lincoln Post like wildfire. Martha from the general store was particularly delighted, confiding to Theodora that she'd seen it coming from the moment you two walked into my store together. The following day, with her wagon repaired and loaded, Theodora bid farewell not to Kieran but to her old plans. Together, they drove to the schoolhouse where she submitted her application to the delighted school board, who hired her on the spot when they learned of her qualifications. 3 days later, they were married in a simple ceremony attended by the entire settlement. Theodora wore a cream-colored dress purchased from Martha's store, and Kieran wore a new suit that actually fit him properly. Their vows were straightforward and heartfelt, promises to cherish and support each other through whatever life brought their way. The expanded cabin was ready by the time winter arrived, with a separate classroom area where Theodora could tutor children too far from town to attend the schoolhouse regularly. Their life together was not without challenges: harsh weather, occasional illness, the normal adjustments of two independent people learning to share a life, but the foundation laid during those first days proved solid. On the anniversary of the storm that had brought them together, Kieran built a fire in their hearth and kept it burning until dawn, a tradition they would maintain throughout their lives. As they sat before the flames, Theodora resting against his chest with their infant daughter sleeping in her arms, she marveled at how a broken wagon wheel had led her to the life she hadn't known she was seeking. "Any regrets?" Kieran asked softly, his arms encircling his family. Theodora looked up at the man who had rescued her from more than just a storm, the man who had shown her that solitude wasn't the answer to grief. That connection was. "Not a single one," she answered truthfully. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance, but within their home, all was warmth and light and love, a fire that would continue burning long after dawn. Spring turned to summer, summer to fall, and fall to winter in a rhythm that marked the passing years with gentle constancy. The Davenport homestead grew along with their family, first with the addition of a son 2 years after their daughter's birth, then with a second daughter 3 years later. The cabin expanded accordingly, with Kieran adding rooms as needed, always with large windows that let in the prairie light Theodora had come to love. The schoolhouse in Lincoln Post flourished under Theodora's guidance. Children who might once have received only the most basic education now studied literature, mathematics, history, and science with enthusiasm. Parents who had initially been skeptical of the Eastern woman's methods became her staunchest supporters when they saw their children's minds opening to new possibilities. Kieran found that partnership suited him better than solitude ever had. The ghosts of his war experiences never entirely disappeared, but they faded to manageable shadows as he built a life focused on creation rather than destruction. He expanded his small cattle operation, planted an orchard, and even began breeding horses that became known throughout the territory for their intelligence and stamina. Together, they weathered the hardships inevitable in frontier life: drought years when crops failed and cattle grew thin, a scarlet fever outbreak that claimed several children in the settlement, though their own were mercifully spared, the winter when temperatures dropped so low that they all slept in the main room near the constantly burning stove. Through it all, the story of their meeting became something of a legend in Lincoln Post. Her wagon broke down in the storm, and he lit a fire and kept it burning until dawn. People would say, usually adding their own embellishments until Theodora and Kieran could hardly recognize the tale as their own. They didn't mind. The essential truth remained unchanged: a chance encounter had changed the course of their lives. On their 10th anniversary, with the children staying with Martha and her husband for the night, Kieran surprised Theodora by taking her back to the spot where her wagon had broken down a decade earlier. "Why are we here?" she asked as he helped her down from their wagon, now well-maintained and sturdy. "I wanted to thank it," he said with a smile, gesturing to the unremarkable stretch of trail. "Thank a spot on the ground?" She laughed, though she understood the sentiment. "If not for this exact place, this exact rut that broke your wheel, we might never have met," he explained, pulling her into his arms. "You might have continued to Cedar Ridge, married some fortunate shopkeeper or rancher there, and I'd still be alone in my cabin, not knowing what I was missing." Theodora stretched up to kiss him, marveling that after a decade, his touch still sent a thrill through her. "I think we would have found each other somehow," she said when they parted. "Some things are simply meant to be." They made love that night beneath the stars, reconnecting as lovers rather than as parents or partners in daily work. It was a reminder that beneath the routines and responsibilities of their shared life, the spark that had ignited between them in the wake of that long-ago storm still burned brightly. As their children grew, so did Lincoln Post. The railroad arrived when their eldest daughter was 12, bringing new people, new opportunities, and new challenges. The small settlement gradually transformed into a proper town with a mayor, a bank, and eventually even a small college where Theodora was invited to teach literature and history. Their children inherited their parents' best qualities, Kieran's quiet strength and Theodora's compassionate intelligence. Their eldest daughter followed in her mother's footsteps, becoming a teacher and eventually the principal of the school her mother had helped establish. Their son combined his father's affinity for animals with a modern education, becoming a veterinarian who served the entire county. Their youngest daughter surprised them all by developing a talent for law, studying in Denver before returning to establish the town's first female-led legal practice. Through the years, the anniversary of the storm remained special. No matter what else was happening in their lives, Kieran always built a fire on that night and kept it burning until dawn. Sometimes they stayed up together, remembering and dreaming. Other times Theodora would fall asleep in his arms and wake to find him still tending the flames, faithful to their private tradition. When they were in their 60s, with grandchildren playing around their expanded homestead, a journalist from a Denver newspaper came to interview them as one of the territory's founding couples. The young man was particularly interested in how they had met. It was just chance, Kieran told him with a smile at Theodora. Her wagon broke down in a storm, and I happened to be passing by. He lit a fire and kept it burning until dawn, Theodora added, reaching for her husband's hand. He's been keeping me warm ever since. The journalist scribbled notes, clearly hoping for more dramatic details, but that was all they shared publicly. The deeper truth, the recognition they had both felt, the way they had changed each other's lives remained private, a treasure kept between them. In their 70s, when Lincoln Post had become a substantial town and the frontier had largely disappeared, they still rode out occasionally to the spot where they had met. The trail was now a proper road, the surrounding prairie parceled into farms and ranches, but they could still identify the location by the ancient cottonwood that had witnessed their first meeting. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you'd made it to Cedar Ridge? Kieran asked on one such visit, his hair now white but his blue eyes still bright and clear. Sometimes, Theodora admitted, her own auburn hair streaked with silver, but only as a passing thought. This life, our life, has been so full that it's hard to imagine any other. When Kieran passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 82, Theodora carried on their tradition alone, building a fire on the anniversary of the storm and keeping it burning until dawn. Their children and grandchildren joined her in those vigils, listening to her retell the story of the broken wagon, the unexpected rescue, and the love that had flourished against all odds. 3 years later, Theodora followed her husband, leaving behind a legacy of education, family, and community that would continue to shape the region for generations. At her funeral, their eldest grandson read from her journal, where she had written decades earlier. Some might call it chance that my will broke at that precise moment, on that precise stretch of trail, as that precise storm descended. Others might call it fate or divine intervention. I simply call it the beginning of my real life. Before the storm, I was existing. After Kieran found me, I began to live. The townsfolk who had known them, the generations of students Theodora had taught, and the family they had created gathered to celebrate a love story that had begun with a broken wagon, a raging storm, and a man who had lit a fire and kept it burning until dawn and for 50 years beyond. In the cemetery on the hill overlooking what had once been a wild frontier, their headstones stood side by side, bearing a simple inscription beneath their names and dates. The fire still burns. And in the stories told by their descendants, in the school named in Theodora's honor, in the breeding lines of horses that still carried Kieran's mark, in the very fabric of the community they had helped build, the fire did indeed continue to burn, warming generations who would never know them but who benefited from the light they had kindled together on that stormy night so long ago.